Welcome back, BioMonsters, to homework helper number 63, focusing on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Let's go ahead and dive in and look at question number 1. Question number 1 is one of my favorites, and I can guarantee you that you're going to see something similar to this on an assessment coming up real soon. So for this, to demonstrate that you really understand the relationship and the differences between photosynthesis, you really need to understand the cyclical relationship between the two chemical equations. And one of the way to do that is to think about what are we starting with, so what are the reactants, and also what are we ending with, also known as the products. And then once we figure that out, we can go ahead and use those pieces of information and plug them in to figure out what our total chemical equation actually is. So let's start out with photosynthesis. Synthesis is the way in which plants capture sunlight and use the energy from the light to make their own food, specifically to make glucose, C6H12O6. So in order to start this process, we're going to need reactants. So these are things that we're going to use. Another way to think about reactants is that this is always on the left side of the chemical equation versus products that are always on the right-hand side or on the right-hand side of the arrow. So what do we need in order to start this process of photosynthesis? To start photosynthesis, we're obviously going to need light because that's going to generate the energy. That's where we're getting the energy to actually do what we need to do to drive the process to completion. Another thing that we're going to need in order to ensure that the chemical reaction takes place, we actually have to feed in water. And remember, the chemical equation for water is H2O. And then we're still going to need some other things. So there's this particular gas that plants need in order to power or to provide the raw materials for photosynthesis. And the gas that we're going to need is something called carbon dioxide. The chemical formula for carbon dioxide, because it's important to know, is CO2. So we have three things or three reactants that we're feeding into photosynthesis. Now let's go ahead and drop down and look at our products. So the products are what is being made or what we get out or what's being released from the chemical reaction. So if we feed into a photosynthetic organism light, water, and carbon dioxide, we're going to be able to get out a number of different things. One of the things that we're going to get out is a byproduct. The byproduct is a gas that we're no longer going to use or that the plant doesn't need, and the gas is going to be oxygen. And the chemical formula for oxygen is O2. Plants are also going to get another product out, which is really important because this is the substance that's actually used as food for the plant. It's a high-powered energy molecule that's a type of sugar, and it's something called glucose. And glucose has a chemical formula, C6H12O6. Now that we've figured out what the reactants and the products are for photosynthesis, let's go ahead and figure out what the products are for respiration. And respiration means the same thing as cellular respiration. So the interesting thing about these two processes is that the reactants for photosynthesis become the outputs or the products for respiration, and the products for respiration become the reactants for cellular, or the products for photosynthesis become the reactants for cellular respiration. So we can say that they have a cyclical relationship, and that simply means that they're connected in a path that looks something like this. So let's go ahead and figure out what we need to start the process of cellular respiration. We're going to need a type of gas, and the gas that we all need because we do this is something called oxygen. And again, the chemical formula is O2. We're also going to need a high-powered compound type of sugar, and we get this sugar from plants or from things that have eaten plants that we then consume. And that's going to be something called glucose. And the chemical formula for glucose again is C6H12O6. So that's what I'm starting with in order to drive the process of cellular respiration. Now what I get out of this, or the products of this process, are going to be similar to the reactants of photosynthesis. So what do I get out of this? Well, I know I'm going to be releasing a gas because as you're breathing out, something is leaving you. And that gas is called carbon dioxide. And again, the chemical formula for carbon dioxide is CO2. Something else that I'm going to be giving off as a byproduct is water. And the chemical formula of water, again, is H2O. And the last thing that I'm going to get out of this process is something that I really need. So it's the whole reason why we're doing this entire process. I actually need a compound, a high energy compound that can be used to drive all other metabolic or chemical reactions inside of a living organism, including myself. So we're going to need something called ATP. And if you remember from our notes, ATP stands for energy, or adenosine triphosphate. Now let's go ahead and put these things into their actual equation. Chemical equation for photosynthesis is going to include, on the left-hand side, all of these things in the top box, but we're going to use it in the form of its actual chemical equation. And everything on the right-hand side is going to be found from this box. And again, we're going to make sure to use the chemical equation. So here's what it looks like for photosynthesis. We're going to feed in 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 H2O molecules plus light, and that takes care of everything in our first box. And what that yields is C6H12O6, which is our glucose, plus 6O2, which is our oxygen byproduct. So to make sure that we know what each one of these things are, our CO2 is our carbon dioxide, which came from the first box. H2O is our water, which came from the first box, and obviously light came from the sun. Then we have C6H12O6, which is our glucose, which is our product right here. And then we have 6O2, and that's our oxygen. Now let's go ahead and fill in what our cellular respiration equation will look like. So this time we're basically just inverting this equation. We're flipping it around. So instead of starting with what we have on top, we're going to start with this. We're just going to feed it in. So we're going to have C6H12O6, which is our glucose, plus 6 oxygen molecules. And when we have that, it's going to yield the following: 6 CO2 molecules plus 6 H2O molecules plus our energy. And everybody should know when we say energy, we're talking about ATP. All right, now that we have that, we're going to use this chart to help us fill in the diagram below. So looking at number 2, it says use the following diagram to answer the questions below. So looking at number 1, it says letter blank is a chloroplast. Now just to remind you, a chloroplast always looks like a little biscuit that has 2 membranes, and then inside the biscuit we have little stacks of cookies that look like this. So you're always looking for a picture that looks something very similar to this picture. And if I look here, I see that this definitely looks like that. So F is going to be the answer to number 1. Number 2, we're looking for the mitochondrion, also known as a mitochondria, so you don't get confused. Mitochondria are always going to look like kidney beans that have a maize inside of them. So here's my mitochondria. So if I look, the only other option is letter E. Number 3, this is where photosynthesis takes place. Well, we know photosynthesis only takes place in the chloroplast because it's the only thing that contains pigment to capture the sun's energy. So that's going to be F. That means that cellular respiration takes place in the powerhouse of the cell, or the mighty mitochondria. So it's going to be letter E. For number 5, we're trying to figure out what represents light. And remember, this is a cyclical relationship. So unless both of them use it, we're always going to be looking for something that's coming in from the outside that represents light, and that's going to be A. So this is going to be our sun, which gives us our light. Looking at what represents CO2, CO2 is represented by something that's going to be created by one thing and taken in by another. And if we think about the equation looking up here, we know that CO2 is needed, so we're taking CO2 in photosynthesis or at the chloroplast, and CO2 is going to be given off or made at the mitochondria or during the process of cellular respiration. And if that's the case, looking at my picture, I know that E is our mitochondria. It's giving off CO2, and that CO2 can be used by our plant. So it's going to be represented by B. Then it's asking what's being represented by oxygen, or what represents oxygen. Well, again, we're going to ask ourselves the same thing. What makes it? And we know that photosynthesis makes it, and photosynthesis happens here. and cellular respiration needs it. So this is going to be my O2. So D is going to be representing oxygen. And then lastly, we're looking for the letter that represents usable energy, and our usable energy is ATP. So it's what's coming off of the mitochondria because it's the powerhouse, it's what's making it. So this is going to be my ATP, so it's going to be letter C. And then our last question to finish up our homework is to explain why the process of photosynthesis and cellular respiration are often referred to as a cycle. And this is a big deal question. You're going to see it many, many times as we're going through our practice problems and also the real thing on the assessment. Now, the easiest way to think about that is to think about the equation. So remember, if we look at what we feed into photosynthesis or our reactants become the products for cellular respiration. The products for cellular respiration. And if we look at the products for photosynthesis, the products for photosynthesis become the reactants for cellular respiration. So that's all we have to say. So we're going to say it's cyclical because the products of photosynthesis become the reactants of cellular respiration. And then we can continue on and say the products of cellular respiration become the reactants of photosynthesis. All right, if you have any questions about today's homework helper, please feel free to stop by and see us because you're going to see very similar questions again in the near future on a formative or a summative assessment. Thanks, guys.